I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to speak to you and the members of the Rules Committee. The proposed statehood comprises about 68 square miles. That's in the ballpark of 1/10 of 1% of my home state of Georgia. And the reason it's such a small area is because Washington, D.C. obviously is a city. It's not a state, it's a city. And there is no such thing as statehood for cities. Atlanta is not a city. Chicago is not a city. Los Angeles is not a city. The supporters of the D.C. statehood bill are arguing for the creation of something that our Constitution does not allow. It really is that simple. The attempt is to seek to convert a city and the city government into a micro state with all the rights, responsibilities, and privileges of a state. But America is not classical Greek. This is not Sparta. This is not Athens. And for us to go down this path is somewhere we don't need to go. Our founders intended specifically for us to have a separate district that is our seat of government that is not influenced by a state. In fact, it's totally fair and right, proper to say that our framers specifically crafted the Constitution to avoid this very situation. And I want to say that again, our framers crafted the Constitution for the distinct purpose of avoiding a situation like this. They did not want our federal government to be within any state. In fact, James Madison expressed it in Federalist number 43, where he said that the capital city, if it were situated within a state, the federal government would be subject to undue influence by that host state. And so make no mistake, this whole thing really creates Washington, D.C. and puts Washington, D.C. in a position of superiority to any other city or any other state if the statehood bill were to pass. This is a superiority bill that puts this city and potentially this state in a position like no other city or state in our nation. But that is what this bill ultimately would do. And I would further state that as members of Congress, we cannot legislate this 51st state into existence, making the District of Columbia the 51st state would require a constitutional amendment. And I know that supporters of this bill state otherwise, but it would. There's no way around this. The 23rd Amendment, just for an example, the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution grants this district 3 electoral votes. That's the amount that a small state would be allowed. But it's important for us to understand that the 23rd Amendment would need to be repealed before this proposed bill could be enacted. Otherwise, the residents of the new state would only be the president and his family, and based upon the 23rd Amendment, they would have 3 electoral votes. How could that be? Obviously, that goes contrary to a plethora of constitutional issues as well as election violations. And obviously, I would say that is in direct contrast to the Democrats' grievances already, many of them, with the Electoral College as it is. Would they really want the president to have 3 electoral votes for him and his family? Well, obviously, that would have to be repealed for this to move forward. And so repealing a constitutional amendment requires passing of another constitutional amendment. I actually brought forth some of these amendments in our markup, among other things, to expedite the proposed constitutional amendment process. But the Democrats opposed that amendment, as they did 14 other amendments. And I would also say that the Democrats also believe that excluding a small federal enclave from the new state would not require a constitutional amendment. That simply is not true. The Constitution does not make a distinction. It does not make a distinction between the seat of our federal government and the district where that government is seated. It's all one and the same. The plain language in the Constitution speaks for itself, and we cannot escape that. We simply can't escape it. The Constitution does not grant Congress exclusive authority over the district where the government is seated. And in fact, since 1963, every Justice Department that has addressed the district statehood issue has decided that Congress cannot alter the status of DC legislatively. So as a result, to make DC the 51st state, make no mistake, there must be passed by Congress and ratified by the states a constitutional amendment. And there's just nowhere near that kind of support. In fact, a majority of Americans do not support DC statehood. In 2019, Gallup did a poll and found that 64% of Americans oppose DC statehood. Only 29% approved it. Gallup also found that Americans have consistently opposed DC statehood in polls over the last 3 decades. And I would just bring up one final consideration in my opening statement is that the district is not prepared to shoulder the burden of statehood. And this would apply economically, fiscally, as well as a host of other ways. But let me just give this example since it was just brought up. Following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, of course, we all know that civil unrest took place in multiple places throughout our country, including right here in Washington, D.C. On May 29th, protesters crowded Lafayette Square and streets outside the White House. They were throwing water bottles. They were doing a host of activities that were just destructive in multiple ways. We saw the fires. Even with the church, people began rioting and looting from Georgetown to Foggy Bottom, down H Street, and all across a host of places. We saw the fire at St. John's Episcopal Church. And all of this, the response from May 29th to the 31st was the Metropolitan Police Department and the U.S. Park Police attempted to quell and to quieten the crowd and to bring a peaceful situation. The mayor even imposed as well as other attempts were ignored by protesters, and in fact, they were not even enforced by the municipal government. It was not until June 1st when Attorney General William Barr deployed federal riot teams, National Guardsmen, and an assortment of federal officers from the FBI, from DEA, and from ATF. Finally, the violence subsided. In fact, from May 29th to the 2nd, when it was largely the municipal authorities who were quelling the violence, there were 427 arrests. On June 3rd, when the federal officers in D.C. were on the streets, there were only 3. So this is just one example of federal intervention compared to the MPD, where they could not contain the protest, they could not stop the violence that was taking place in the district, proving yet again just how fundamental the federal government is in Washington, D.C., in this instance, for maintaining order and civility. And so, I mean, there's just a host of ways that we can go here, Mr. Chairman, and I, again, appreciate your time, and with that, I'll yield back. But there are major problems every direction on the D.C. statehood issue, and I'll yield back.